The sky above the hive city shatters not with lightning but with fire. It crawls across the steel girders of forgotten manufactorums and dances along the rail lines, where the servitors march like clockwork phantoms. I hear it before I see it. A grinding, rasping engine, yet alive with a hunger that no Xenos plague or heretic blast could satisfy. They call it the Wraith of Flame in whispers on the lower spires, a soul bound to vengeance hunting in a galaxy already soaked in blood. Some say it is demon, some say miracle, and yet others believe it is a fallen enforcer of the Emperor, returned to meet justice where the Imperium dares not. I have seen it tear through the streets of Gathis Hive, fire trailing like a comet of judgment, leaving only silence and scorched steel behind. The air smells of burning promethium and ash, and I can't help but wonder what it sees in the faces of men, women, and Adeptus alike as it passes. Fear, defiance, or something more. Before we go any further, I need to be honest with you. Sometimes I look into this endless void, and I see that 99% of you wander these stories but never swear your allegiance. If you stand with me among these tales of war, faith, and fire, then subscribe. It means more than you know. It helps these chronicles of the Imperium reach others who still remember what humanity once was. And tell me, from which world, hive, or system do you watch? I always read your messages. It reminds me that even across the stars, the spirit of mankind still listens. The air of Gathis Hive clung to my skin like a second layer, thick with soot and the bitter tang of burnt promethium. Every inhalation tasted of iron and despair, and even the flickering glow of the manufactorum furnaces seemed dim under the weight of the city's ceaseless grind. I walked among the servitors, their joints whirring with the precision of machines that had long forgotten the pulse of life, and I felt the subtle, unrelenting rhythm of a hive that lived only to consume itself. Above me, the sky was nothing but smoke-stained steel and the lattice of cargo spires, their heights vanishing into shadow, and the distant hum of anti-air turrets provided a constant reminder that the Imperium never slept, even when the people below did not live. I had been on the lower levels, among the forgotten corridors where shadows pooled like spilled ink, when I first sensed it, not through sight or sound, but a vibration in the air, subtle as the tremor before an earthquake. The metal beneath my boots thrummed, a deep resonance that made the hairs on my neck rise. At first I dismissed it as machinery or some overtaxed conduit, yet the whispers of the laborers around me were uneasy, their eyes darting skyward, as though expecting something unnatural to descend. And then I heard the engine, grinding and keening with a voice that was not mechanical but alive, a sound that made the very air shiver and bend. They would later call it the Wraith of Flame, though I knew no title could contain the sensation of fear and awe it provoked. By the time I glimpsed it, the thing was already among the streets, moving faster than any walker, faster than thought. Fire licked the edges of its skeletal frame, a blaze that did not consume itself yet left the scent of charred steel and scorched flesh trailing in its wake. It was not an orc ramshackle engine or a Xenos contraption. Its design was cruelly elegant, a motorcycle-shaped harbinger fused with bone and steel, riding on a tide of pure, predatory flame. I watched from the shadows as it passed, silent to all but me, and for a moment I swore the fire burned only the sins of those it judged. The Arbites had rounded the corner moments later, their vox grills barking orders to squads who never reached the scene. By then, the Wraith was gone, leaving nothing but molten scars along the roads and the faint echo of a voice that might have been a whisper, or might have been the city itself crying. I learned quickly that rumors in the hive spread faster than promethium fire, and in the days that followed, the name traveled through the corridors and workyards. The Wraith did not strike at the innocent, at least not in the eyes of those it hunted. Corrupt foremen, bureaucrats who skimmed rations from the poor, enforcers who twisted law into cruelty. These were the ones who vanished in a flash of flame, their screams swallowed by the roar of combustion. Others said it spoke, though I never heard the words, only the sensation that each victim had been judged by something older than Terra, something that understood the worth of a soul without question or hesitation. The air itself seemed to tremble where it passed, and even the Adeptus Mechanicus murmured among themselves, calling it a fragment of vengeance, a relic of some unknown purity that had slipped the grasp of human understanding. I began to follow the trail, not out of courage, but necessity. The lower levels of the hive, usually drowned in routine, were now a maze of molten metal, singed banners, and the hushed sobs of witnesses. The fire left no survivors among those it condemned, and the streets were littered with objects frozen mid-motion: a dropped data slate, a cogwheel, a cup of contaminated water. Every fragment felt like a message, a taunt, a warning. I could smell the ozone in the air, thick and acrid, and hear the faint, almost musical resonance of the engine's fading growl in the tunnels beneath my feet. And yet, in the midst of fear there was fascination, even among the workers who had once spat on heretics or cursed the Scutari for their relentless patrols. There was now a reverent pause when the name was spoken. Whispers suggested it was judgment incarnate, a soul bound to a cosmic fire, arriving only when the Imperium's own bureaucracy could not enforce justice. Some prayed for it, some cursed it, but all understood that life in Gathis Hive had shifted. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, awaiting its return, and I felt it. A gnawing certainty that something had arrived in this galaxy that was neither man nor machine. And yet in its presence the sins of all flesh became painfully visible. I remember standing atop a scorched stairwell, watching smoke curl like serpents through the skeletal frames of factories and shops, listening to the distant hum of Vox grills sending reports that would never make sense. The wraith of flame had passed, and in the streets below, the people began to feel a new weight, heavier than taxation or war, the weight of being watched, judged, and perhaps doomed. I felt a strange kinship with the Watchers of old, the custodians who walked corridors of fire and steel, knowing order could only hold for so long before it was consumed. And for the first time I realized the Hive, and perhaps the Imperium itself, had no understanding of what had arrived, nor the power to stop it. Even in that first encounter, as I turned to descend into the shadows again, I sensed it, not a presence but an inevitability. The flame would return, the streets would burn, and the sins of humanity, from Gathis Hive to Terra itself, might find a reckoning older and purer than any man could dictate. I stepped over a molten grate, feeling the heat pulse against my boots, and knew the stories had only begun. Rumors spread faster than flame through dry timber in Gathis Hive, and by the third day after the first sighting, the streets were alive with whispers. Every factory foreman and cleric, every Arbeits officer and Scutaria patrolman, spoke of the same thing in hushed, fearful tones. The wraith of flame was real, and it was coming for those who had strayed from the Emperor's light. The air itself seemed heavier, infused with an electric anxiety that made even seasoned workers flinch at the hiss of a steam vent or the sudden clang of a steel girder. I moved among them, unseen yet hyper-aware, tracing the tremors in their behavior, the subtle ways fear reshaped the city's rhythm. The wraith was no longer a phantom. It had become a reckoning, a force that had inserted itself into the pulse of the Hive. I learned quickly that the wraith's judgments were not indiscriminate. It hunted only those whose corruption had festered in silence, accountants who skimmed credits meant for laborers, Arbeits officers who abused the law for personal gain, and bureaucrats who had built careers on the suffering of the poor. In the corridors of power, the survivors whispered that the wraith saw what the Codex Imperialis could not. The streets became its jury, and the fires it left behind were both punishment and proof, scorch marks etched into the psyche of every witness. I followed the aftermath in silence, watching the reactions of those who had glimpsed it. Wide-eyed shock, hands pressed in prayer, the quiet tremor of bodies caught between fear and awe. There was a peculiar rhythm to its passage. It came without warning, descending through the lower levels like a vengeful comet, yet it did not linger. By the time the Arbeits arrived, summoned by Vox grills and alarm bells, the streets were empty, and the guilty had vanished, leaving only melted metal, ash, and the faint stench of scorched flesh. Witnesses swore the air still shimmered where the fire had passed, and some claimed to hear whispered voices among the ruins. Not commands, not curses, but an understanding that defied human comprehension. I could not tell whether these voices were in their minds or in the air itself, but each account carried the same weight. The wraith judged, and its judgments were final. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus began to murmur, cautiously behind layers of iron and cogitator screens. A few scholars dared speculate that it was a fragment of a forgotten enforcer, bound to the Emperor's will, perhaps awakened by the corruption festering in the Hive. Others suggested a demon clothed in flame, a manifestation of vengeance itself. though such words were never spoken aloud in the halls of the Omnissiah. I listened from the shadows, recording every scrap of observation I could, knowing that no official report would ever convey the sheer terror and awe of standing in a street moments after the wraith had passed. The laborers, the lowest of the low, began to leave marks where they saw it. Crude sigils drawn in ash, prayers etched on walls in soot, even offerings of scrap metal laid at the scorched junctions of manufactorum corridors. They called it the Fire Judge, a being that was punished not with law but with the certainty of a flame that understood the worth of every soul. I walked among these offerings, feeling the weight of a hive learning, for the first time in its history, to fear and revere something beyond bureaucracy and codex. The streets themselves seemed to pulse with the memory of its passage, the charred walls almost warm with an unspoken knowledge. I began to see it not just in the aftermath, but in fleeting glimpses. The glow of fire reflected in the lenses of a Skitarii helm, the shadow of a skeletal frame moving too quickly for the eye to track, the sudden heat of a rail vent when no promethium flow should have been active. Every encounter reinforced the same truth. This was not a creature of flesh or machine alone. It was judgment incarnate, a predator tuned to morality in a universe where morality was a matter of doctrine, law, and convenience. In a hive that consumed life to sustain its own, that fed on obedience and fear, the wraith was the first thing to measure the cost of sin in pure flame. Some of the victims left behind traces of what they had been: a scorched data slate, a folded ration slip, the bent arm of a Skitarii corpse still gripping its weapon. Others vanished entirely, as if the fire had consumed not just flesh but memory. Witnesses said they could hear the echo of screams in the charred alleys, though no one could confirm they had come from the living. And still, through it all, the city's heartbeat continued, grinding inexorably against the inevitability of the wraith's next judgment. I realized then that the hive had become a courtroom, its streets corridors of testimony, and the wraith of flame both executioner and arbiter, measuring guilt in ways no codex or tribunal could. By the end of the second day, I understood the unspoken rule: survive and you might yet escape judgment. Fail, and the fire would find you. Even the bravest Arbites officers avoided lower corridors now, and Skitarii patrols reported strange, fleeting shadows beyond their sensors. Though no machinery could survive the heat and no data slate recorded the motion, those who dared speak openly of what they had seen were silenced, not by law but by fear, and I walked among them invisible, recording every terrified glance, every whispered prayer, knowing that I had witnessed the first true stirrings of a force that could not be reasoned with, bargained with, or imprisoned. As night fell, the hive became a labyrinth of trembling lights and glowing fissures, every vent and grate a potential sign of its return. I stood atop a steel scaffold overlooking a plaza that had once thrived with commerce and labor, now a field of molten slag and twisted metal. The wind carried a scent of flame and ash so intense it burned the lungs, and in the distance I thought I saw it. A flicker of skeletal form riding through the haze, the roar of its engine like the breath of a god. It passed in an instant, leaving only silence, yet the world felt changed. The hive had learned in fire and shadow that judgment was real, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me deeper than the smoke or the darkness that this was only the beginning. The Imperium, vast and unyielding, is a creature of rules, ritual, and repetition. I had spent years walking its corridors, observing the meticulous precision of servitors, Skitarii, and the Adeptus Arbits, and yet, in the days following the Wraith's first passage, I saw something I had never imagined. Panic threading through the veins of bureaucracy. Reports flowed into data slates in a continuous torrent, each echoing the same impossible events. Manufactorums reported engines failing as if they had been melted by internal fire. Rations disappeared from commissariat stores without explanation. Surveillance feeds flickered, not from interference but from something that seemed to understand their very purpose and evade it. The chains of the Imperium, forged over millennia to crush rebellion and chaos, trembled before an adversary that obeyed no law, respected no codex, and answered to no human authority. I watched the Arbites deploy squads into the lower levels, their boots clanging against catwalks slick with ash, their vox grills crackling with static as orders collided with reality. The officers moved with mechanical precision, yet their faces betrayed something beneath discipline: fear. Not the fear of an enemy they could see or understand, but the kind that gnaws at the core of certainty. Each squad that returned brought fragmented accounts, flashes of fire, glimpses of skeletal form, cries that lingered in the corridors long after bodies had vanished. No one could explain it, and the Arbites were not accustomed to inexplicable phenomena. Some whispered of a demon, others of a fragment of a forgotten enforcer bound to an oath older than the Imperium itself. In their minds, doubt and superstition mingled with protocol, a dangerous combination in a hive that depended on order above all else. The Skitarii, with their cogitators and cybernetic precision, fared no better. Patrols that had once scoured the lower levels without pause returned reporting sensors unable to detect the wraith, yet still it struck. Heat signatures would flare briefly, then vanish. Laser grids melted as if the metal had turned to liquid under an unseen hand. Some veterans claimed that it moved not just faster than they could track, but in ways that violated the geometry of the manufactorums themselves, appearing on a catwalk one moment and at the far end of a corridor the next. Tech priests debated endlessly whether this was a malfunction, a warp incursion, or something beyond the Omnissiah's comprehension. I listened silently in the shadows, noting the subtle tremor of hands that once never faltered, and the quiet muttering of words meant only for the cogitator's ears, prayers disguised as calculations, appeals to a deity in steel and flame. Even the data slates of the Hive Administratum were overwhelmed. Reports arrived faster than clerks could process them, describing fires that consumed nothing but guilt, disappearances that left no trace, and the lingering impression that judgment had passed through. High-ranking functionaries attempted to rationalize, to apply logic to chaos, but in the maze of corridors, each explanation collided with the next, fracturing certainty. It became clear that the Wraith of Flame was not merely a force moving through space. It was a mirror, reflecting the flaws and corruption that the Imperium had long buried beneath codices, statutes, and the unquestioned rule of law. Every scorched stairwell, every melted conduit was a testament not only to its power but to the inability of man and machine to restrain it. The citizens of Gathis Hive felt it too. Laborers who once bent under quotas or cursed the commissariat now paused mid-task, hands trembling, ears straining for the distant rasp of flame. Even the children, scuttling between scaffolds and conduits, sensed a presence older than their lives, something that demanded attention and respect. I began recording these observations in private, aware that any overt study might invite suspicion or worse, accusation of heresy. The Wraith of Flame existed outside the hierarchy, a force that made the meticulously constructed chains of the Imperium appear brittle, almost fragile. Its existence questioned the certainty that had sustained the galaxy for 10,000 years. Rumors began to emerge from the lower levels, murmurs that spread faster than any official communique. Some claimed it was a servant of the Emperor, sent to punish the guilty when the Imperium failed to act. Others whispered that it was a demon of fire and vengeance, bound by the sorrow of a world long dead. I could not tell which, if either, was true. What I could observe, however, was undeniable. Every trace of its passage was deliberate, almost sentient in execution. The fires it left were precise, burning not indiscriminately, but in patterns that suggested calculation. The echoes of its engine lingered, as if testing the city, measuring its resilience, and marking its sins. By the fifth day, a strange rhythm had taken hold in Gathis Hive. Arbites patrols moved with heightened caution. Skitarii adjusted their sensors and recalibrated their weapons, and laborers whispered prayers in the alleys, offering whatever tokens they could find to stave off judgment. The Imperium's machinery continued its relentless work, but beneath the veneer of steel and cogitator logic, an uneasy understanding had settled. Some force had arrived that obeyed no orders, recognized no hierarchy, and punished without mercy. I walked among the terrified, the awestruck and the indifferent alike, feeling the weight of history pressing down on the hive, realizing that the chains of the Imperium were no longer sufficient to contain the unexpected, the supernatural, or the justly vengeful. And in that understanding, I felt it. Not fear exactly, but a dawning comprehension that this was only the beginning. The Wraith of Flame moved with intent, with purpose, and in its wake, the Imperium's intricate clockwork faltered. The machinery of man was immense, eternal even, yet it had encountered a force that could bend its reality, warp its order, and measure its soul. I descended again into the lower corridors where shadows pooled like ink and the faint smell of burnt steel lingered. I knew the city had been changed, that the chains of the Imperium had been tested and that the Wraith of Flame would return. And when it did, the consequences would ripple far beyond Gathi's hive, touching the very heart of the galaxy. By the time the lower levels of Gathi's hive had begun to quiet, the stories of the Wraith of Flame had grown wings of their own. Every whispered account, every sacred confession among the laborers, arbits, and even low-ranking tech priests carried the same weight. This was no ordinary threat, no Xenos contraption or malfunctioning engine. Its nature was uncertain, its origin hidden beneath layers of fire and smoke. Yet in every description there was a shared understanding of one truth. The Wraith judged, and its judgment was inexorable. From the shadowed corridors of manufactorums to the sanctified halls of minor chapels, whispers grew into legend, each retelling richer than the last, weaving a tapestry of rumor that defied codex and canon alike. The tech priests, obsessed with patterns, began documenting the passages of flame in hushed conferences, calibrating their augurs to detect heat, motion, even the subtlest distortion of gravitic fields. They speculated in cryptic formulas and ritualized calculations that the Wraith might be an echo of an enforcer long dead, a fragment bound by oath to a higher justice than the Imperium itself could administer. Some went further, muttering prayers to the Omnissiah, claiming that this spectral engine of vengeance was a living manifestation of law and order, unbound by bureaucracy and far beyond human comprehension. Every hypothesis carried its own danger. Even a whisper of demonhood could mark the speaker for scrutiny or termination. Yet the Wraith's legend thrived in these shadows, carried by the codex of rumor, and grew in stature faster than the administrative machinery of the hive could contain. Among the citizens, the Wraith's passage became almost religious in nature. Children hid in soot-streaked alcoves, crossing themselves when the faint rasp of flame reached their ears. Laborers drew crude sigils in ash or painted protective glyphs over walls and doorways, praying for safety or favor, even if they could not name the deity to whom they addressed their devotion. To them, the Wraith was neither machine nor man nor demon, but a force of moral inevitability, moving through the hive to correct imbalance, corruption, and cruelty. I watched from shadows as they performed these rites, feeling the uneasy intertwining of superstition, faith, and the raw terror of the unknown. Every act of devotion reinforced the impression that this being, whatever it was, occupied a space larger than life, larger than law, larger than the Imperium itself. Even the psychers spoke quietly, fearful that their words might attract attention or warp their minds further. They described glimpses in the warp, shadows streaked with fire and the sharp taste of judgment, visions that suggested the Wraith existed both in our reality and somewhere beyond it. Some believed it could traverse the immaterium in a manner similar to a demon, yet it bore no mark of chaos, no twisted sigil or malevolent gleam in its eyes. Others whispered that it was an emissary of the Emperor, a fragment of divine wrath incarnate, returning at long intervals to remind mankind of its own sins. I recorded each of these accounts with careful precision, aware that the truth, if truth existed in such matters, would remain elusive, and that perception often shaped reality in ways that cold logic could never fully grasp. The Imperium's higher echelons, alerted by the hive's administratum and the cacophony of Arbite's reports, were perplexed. Missives sent to the Mechanicus Collegia and minor planetary governors contained every detail possible: scorched pathways, vanished citizens, residual heat readings, eyewitness testimony, yet none could provide a coherent explanation. Some dismissed the entire matter as overreaction, a series of coincidental accidents or hysteria among the hive's lower classes. Others quietly admitted to themselves, behind layers of data slates and secrecy, that no known technology, no known doctrine, could account for the phenomena. The Wraith existed outside the chains of the Imperium, a variable that no calculation could fully capture. Among the underground networks, smugglers, heretics, and radicals who thrived in the spaces between law and survival, the Wraith's legend became a kind of currency. They spoke of it as if it were a god of vengeance, a being that could be bargained with or invoked, though none had survived an encounter to confirm it. Even whispers among orc raiders or minor Xenos enclaves suggested unease. Word spread that the flames did not discriminate based on allegiance. only on the presence of guilt, cruelty, or ambition twisted against the weak. This rumor alone carried weight, for even creatures outside the Imperium respected fear as much as fire. I found myself walking these shadowed corridors more frequently, watching the city, feeling the pulse of its fear, and sensing the legend growing like a living thing. Each ember left behind, each scorched marking in the streets was not only a record of judgment, but a testament to the incomprehensible morality encoded within the Wraith. I realized then that the hive itself had become an altar, and we, all of us, from the lowest laborer to the most exalted tech priest, had become witnesses to something larger than the Imperium, larger than life itself. The fire was both story and executioner, rumor and reality, and in that delicate, terrifying balance, the Wraith moved ever onward. And so the whispers grew louder, echoing through manufactorum halls, vibrating in data slates and traveling even to the distant, fortified sanctums of minor governors. Some called it prophecy, some called it heresy. I called it inevitable. And in the quiet moments before the engines of the hive resumed their endless grind, I understood the truth that would haunt every step I took. The Wraith of Flame was not bound by law, by creed, or even by human comprehension, and its judgments would continue until the sins of mankind were burned away, or the hive itself was reduced to ash. The lower levels of Gathis hive were no longer a place for the timid. Every corridor, every stairwell seemed to hum with anticipation, as if the very walls awaited judgment. It was here, amid the ash-strewn manufactorums and molten slag of ruined streets, that I first encountered the others who, willingly or not, would walk alongside the Wraith's path. They were a fractured collection, a Skitarii veteran with her optic lenses scorched from a misfired plasma coil, an Arbit sergeant whose loyalty had been tested by years of bureaucracy and brutality, and a laborer whose only crime had been curiosity, too fierce for a hive that rewarded obedience. Each carried their own burdens, their own sins, yet all were drawn together by circumstance and perhaps by necessity to witness the flame that could not be tamed. The Skitarii, known only as Magos Valrin in whispered records, moved with the silent precision of one who had long learned that observation was survival. Her limbs were half machine, but the fire in her eyes was human, unyielding and furious. She did not trust the Wraith, none could. Yet she studied it as one would an equation too complex for the cogitators to compute, marking patterns in its movement, noting the precision of its judgment. Beside her, Arbite's Sergeant Drekal carried the weight of decades in service, his gaunt face lined with the permanent scowl of one who had enforced law without mercy. He understood instinctively that this flame was outside codex, outside authority, and yet it demanded attention. Between the two of them and the lowly laborer, whose name I never learned, a fragile alliance formed, bonded not by camaraderie but by the undeniable fact that they had survived where others had not. Their first attempt to intersect the Wraith's path was cautious. They moved through corridors still warm from its passage, careful not to disturb the ash that had fallen like snow on the floors, leaving behind tiny patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Every step carried a tension thicker than promethium smoke. Magos Valrin's sensors detected faint heat signatures that flickered and vanished too quickly for reason. Drekal swore he heard the engine's rasp echoing through vents that should have been silent. The laborer whispered prayers to saints no one remembered, and then just beyond a scorched stairwell we saw it. A flicker of flame against the shadows, skeletal wheels blazing, yet somehow not consuming itself. The Wraith moved not in haste but with a rhythm that suggested intention, a predator observing, evaluating. The encounter was brief, almost imperceptible, yet it altered the course of all of us. The Wraith did not attack, at least not directly. Instead, it seemed to test, to measure, to place a judgment that none of us could comprehend. Magos Valrin recalibrated her sensors in the aftermath, muttering equations and rituals alike, trying to understand a force that obeyed neither machine nor cannon. Drekal, usually unshakable, clenched his fists, muttering prayers under his breath to gods whose names were long dead, while the laborer trembled but did not flee, his eyes fixed on the scorched path ahead. In that brief intersection, we understood a truth that would shape the days to come. Survival was not enough. One had to understand, to anticipate, to align themselves, however imperfectly, with something entirely alien to human law and reason. Word of our presence spread quickly, though not by conventional means. survivors, those who had escaped the first passages of the Wraith, began leaving subtle signs, scratched symbols in soot, offerings of scrap metal. Whispered guidance meant only for those who sought understanding. We learned to follow these breadcrumbs, interpreting each ember, each faint heat signature as part of a larger pattern. The Wraith did not communicate in words but in fire, in absence, in the lingering heat of judgment. Its language was morality made manifest, and for those attuned to it, a roadmap of survival, or complicity. The alliance itself was fragile, strained by suspicion and unspoken fears. Magos Valren regarded Drekkal's Arbit's training with quiet skepticism, noting the imperfections of human judgment. Drekkal mistrusted the Skitari's machine logic, fearing calculation where conscience should prevail, and the laborer, quiet and unassuming, carried a silent fear of being left behind, of being judged unworthy in ways none of us could articulate. Yet as we moved through the fractured hive, the tension between us became a source of strength. Each skill complemented the other, the precision of machine, the instinct of law, the intuition of the untrained. Alone, none could have survived the Wraith. Together, they might learn enough to walk its path without being consumed. By the third day of our uneasy coalition, we began to see patterns in the Wraith's movements. It struck where corruption festered, where cruelty had gone unpunished for too long. We traced the scorched paths through manufactorums along rail lines and past the hives of the lowest citizens, watching as the legend we had once only whispered about took tangible form. Each fire left a memory, each disappearance a lesson, and as we observed, we understood another truth. The Wraith did not act for vengeance alone. It acted for balance, for measurement, for something older than the Imperium, something whose purpose dwarfed every law, every codex, every Arbite's edict. I remember standing with the three of them on the edge of a collapsed transit shaft, smoke curling into the sky, the faint echo of flame still lingering in the air, and realizing that our survival, and perhaps the survival of the hive itself, depended not on weapons, not on strategy alone, but on understanding a force that defied comprehension. The Embered Alliance, as I began to call it in my private notes, was fragile, temporary, and yet necessary. Alone we would burn. Together we might glimpse the reasoning of judgment incarnate and endure long enough to see what lay beyond the flames. The deeper we ventured into Gathis Hive, the more the city seemed to remember its own past. Long-abandoned manufactorums, forgotten chapels, and sealed sublevels revealed traces of lives, sins, and conspiracies buried beneath centuries of dust and bureaucracy. In these forgotten places, the air smelled of rusted metal, mold, and the faint tang of chemicals no longer in production. The embered paths left by the wraith of flame traced over these sites with almost deliberate intent, revealing the skeletons of old crimes and ancient negligence, as if the fire sought not only the present, but the sins of the past. I began to understand that the wraith was not merely a predator of flesh and machine. It was a revealer, uncovering the hidden corruption that no Codex Arbites or Skitari patrol had ever noticed. Magos Valren moved silently beside me, her cybernetic eyes recording the minutest changes in the metal walls, scanning scorch patterns with calculations that blended machine precision with ritualized observation. "It's deliberate," she murmured, voice low and steady, though her fists were clenched so tightly that even the servitor repairs beneath her synthetic flesh would have registered the tension. Every strike, every flare, every burned corridor follows a logic we cannot yet decipher. It is testing, probing. Drekkal snorted softly, muttering prayers under his breath, his Arbite's instincts screaming caution. Yet even he could not hide the curiosity flickering in his eyes. The laborer, silent as ever, traced a charred mark along a wall, whispering an ancient hymn he claimed to have learned from his grandmother, words older than any sanctioned scripture. I realized then that our alliance, fragile though it was, had begun to attune itself to something beyond mere observation, a language written in fire and ash. In one manufactorum, long sealed for over a century, the Wraith's passage had uncovered a hidden vault. Its doors, encrusted with layers of neglect and corrosion, had resisted every attempt at access until the fire melted the locks without damaging the surrounding metal. Inside, the machinery was ancient, an array of cogitators and servitors that should have been obsolete decades ago, yet still operational in some eerie, dormant way. Data slates stored records that had long been erased from official memory. Embezzlement, neglect, failed experiments, and the names of those who had been sacrificed or erased to cover inconvenient truths. I traced the scorch marks along the floor, noting their patterns, realizing that the Wraith had walked through these corridors with knowledge impossible to possess, marking the forgotten for judgment and leaving the rest untouched. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus could not account for what we found. Rituals of maintenance and blessing performed over decades had failed to preserve these chambers against decay, yet the Wraith's fire left the sacred metal frameworks untouched, as though acknowledging the old pacts while simultaneously indicting the failures of the living. Each embered pathway became a record, a testimony, and a warning that history, no matter how deeply buried, would always be visible to this force. I felt a strange kinship with the city itself, recognizing its fractures and flaws, yet also the inevitability of exposure under the Wraith's gaze. We descended into sub-levels even older, corridors built long before the founding of the current hive, passages that had once housed forgotten sects, heretical experiments, and rituals that had been expunged from all sanctioned record. Here, the Wraith's trail was unmistakable. Molten patterns seared into the walls and floors like ancient runes, evidence of encounters long before any of us could have witnessed. I traced one mark, following it deeper into the catacombs, and realized that the flames had revealed a network of hidden chambers, each containing relics, records, and evidence of crimes that had been carefully erased over centuries. Even the laborer, whose presence had always seemed incidental, paused in awe, whispering that the fire had spoken. What the Wraith judged, I still could not say. It did not burn indiscriminately. Entire manufactorums remained untouched while small chambers crumbled under its flame, revealing crimes long forgotten. Its passage felt almost sentient, a deliberate unearthing of the sins of humanity, a reminder that the Imperium's machinery, no matter how vast or precise, could never fully conceal its failings. We realized that survival alone was meaningless. Understanding the logic, the intent, and the morality behind the Wraith's actions was essential. By the end of that day, we emerged from the labyrinth of forgotten chambers, each of us carrying the weight of revelations too heavy for words. The Wraith of Flame had shown us more than destruction. It had illuminated the fractures, the hypocrisy, and the hidden guilt that no codex or tribunal had ever accounted for. And as we climbed back into the scorched corridors of the main hive, smoke curling into the dim light, I understood a truth that chilled me deeper than any heat or flame. The Wraith did not merely punish the guilty. It revealed them, it measured them, and in its trail, humanity itself would be forced to reckon with its own failures. By the time the Embered Alliance reached the upper levels of Gath's hive, the city had already begun to feel unmoored, as though the very foundations of human order trembled beneath an unseen weight. Fires erupted in manufactorums that had been untouched for centuries, sparks dancing along steel girders like streaks of divine lightning. Entire work blocks were abandoned, their inhabitants scattered into smoke-filled streets, eyes wide with terror and awe. The Arbits had deployed squads, reinforced by Skitarii patrols and even a detachment of Mechanicus servitors, yet their formations were fragmented almost immediately. The Wraith of Flame moved with a speed, precision, and intent no human unit could counter. Its skeletal wheels burned brighter than promethium flares, yet left the steel and stone of the hive largely intact, except for the traces of judgment it left like braille on molten metal. I followed from a distance, unseen, noting the reactions of those around me. Drickal's gaunt face was a mask of concentration, hands trembling only slightly over his weapon. Yet I could see the flicker of something deeper, an understanding that the laws of men no longer applied here. Magos Valryn's lenses glowed as she recalibrated her sensors, muttering equations that twisted over themselves in attempts to model the unmodelable. Even the laborer, silent as ever, seemed to sense the shape of inevitability in the air, moving with a grace that suggested instinct rather than thought. We were no longer just observers. We were participants in a spectacle of judgment that dwarfed all prior understanding. Reports from the upper levels of the hive confirmed what we had begun to suspect. This was no isolated phenomenon. Fires flared in districts long considered secure. Machinery failed inexplicably, and Arbite squads vanished into corridors that minutes before had been deemed clear. Witnesses claimed to hear the rasping engine of the Wraith echoing across multiple sectors at once, though only a single apparition could ever be seen. Rumors among laborers and minor officials suggested that it might exist in multiple planes simultaneously, a fragment of vengeance that could traverse both matter and perception. Even the Mechanicus admitted quietly, behind locked doors and sanctified cogitators, that no known technology could account for these occurrences. The Imperium had encountered something beyond calculation, beyond law, beyond codex. As we pressed onward, the scale of destruction became apparent. Entire manufactorums had been hollowed out by precise bursts of flame, floors melted into molten rivers that cut across assembly lines, and stacks of data slates warped beyond recognition. Yet curiously, the Wraith avoided those who had not strayed into corruption or cruelty. Innocent laborers remained untouched. Shadows moved along walls as though they respected the sanctity of the untainted. The pattern was deliberate, almost moral in its logic, a living codex of judgment that no human tribunal could match. I realized that the Wraith's path through the hive was not chaos. It was law-ridden fire, each strike a decree, each ember a sentence. When the Arbits attempted to intercept, deploying heavily armed squads into the upper districts, the Wraith responded with terrifying precision. Entire units found themselves surrounded in corridors that seemed to shift impossibly, passages melting or bending as though the hive itself obeyed the flame. No shots penetrated its defense, no plasma bolt lingered against its form. It moved not with malice alone, but with a reasoning that suggested calculation, a weighing of threat, guilt, and consequence. Those who survived encounters described a sensation of being measured, of one's sins counted and weighed in the heat of judgment, and I began to understand that the Wraith was not merely punishing. It was elevating awareness, forcing the Imperium itself to confront what it had allowed to fester. By mid-cycle, the upper districts of Gathis Hive were effectively immobilized. Work stopped, manufactorums went silent, and the streets were littered with abandoned carts, tools, and the remnants of lives interrupted. The echo of the Wraith's passage reverberated in the corridors, a constant reminder that no authority, however rigid, could contain it. Magos Valryn recorded every fluctuation in heat, every residual ember, every distortion of the air itself, her calculations growing increasingly complex and uncertain. Drekkal's prayers became louder, more urgent, as if hoping that the gods themselves would intervene where human law had failed. And the laborer, always quiet, now moved with a strange confidence, tracing the scorched paths as though reading a map written in flame. By the end of the day, it was clear. The Wraith of Flame was more than a predator. It was a force that had reshaped the hive, recalibrated the Imperium's sense of order, and elevated judgment beyond human comprehension. I stood on the edge of a collapsed transit bridge, smoke curling around skeletal towers, and felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on me. The Wraith would continue its path, and the Imperium, for all its codices, its Arbites, its Skitarii, and its Mechanicus, was powerless to halt it. The fires of judgment were ascending, and every step we took was shadowed by their reflection. And as the last light of the manufactorum furnaces flickered against the smoke, I understood that the Wraith's passage had become a trial, not just for the guilty, but for all who survived. It was a reckoning in fire, a reminder that law, morality, and the machinery of man were insufficient in the face of a force that judged by a standard older than Terra itself. And in that understanding, I felt the faintest tremor of awe, not fear exactly, but the realization that the Imperium had met a measure of justice that it had long denied itself. By now, the corridors of Gathis Hive were no longer merely streets or manufactorums. They had become sanctuaries of judgment, each charred wall a ledger, each embered floor a testament to the sins of humanity. Magos Valryn moved among them with a quiet reverence, scanning the scorch marks, recording subtle distortions in the metal, calculating with a mind that was part machine, part obsession. Her sensors told her that no energy signature remained beyond the fleeting heat of the flames. Yet the corridors whispered of presence and intention. She muttered under her breath to the Omnissiah, attempting to reconcile calculations with intuition. For the Wraith of Flame did not merely burn, it communicated in patterns and rhythms, in a language older than Codex or Cogitator. Arbite's Sergeant Drekkal, ever the skeptic of all things beyond law, had begun to adjust his approach. His tactical precision, once rigidly codified, now bent to observation, intuition, and instinct. He watched the workers, the survivors, the scorch marks, and he began to understand what no tribunal or edict could convey. The Wraith judged not for vengeance alone, but for the preservation of balance. Where cruelty festered, where corruption thrived, the flame corrected. Where innocence endured, it passed untouched. Drakal muttered prayers to the Emperor under his breath, not in supplication, but in acknowledgement that the scales of human justice were insufficient, and some arbiter beyond law had been dispatched to enforce equilibrium. The laborer, whose name we never knew, became an unwitting interpreter. He traced the scorched walls with fingers blackened by ash, muttering fragments of hymns and old nursery prayers alike. Every gesture, every whispered syllable, seemed to guide us along a path not toward confrontation but toward understanding. The Wraith did not respond to aggression. It responded to presence and perception. Magos Valrun noted the correlation between our careful movements and the timing of its passages, recalibrating her models with each observation. Drakal observed the behavioral patterns of the hive's inhabitants, noting the fear, reverence, and subtle gestures that mirrored what he himself had begun to feel. We were not merely witnesses, we were participants, and our understanding of the Wraith's doctrine became as essential as our survival. Rumors spread rapidly through the hive, amplified by whispers and the faint hum of vox grills that recorded events only partially, never fully capturing the enormity of what had passed. Priests of minor shrines claimed the Wraith was a messenger of divine justice, while Mechanicus adepts argued it was a fragment of an ancient enforcer whose oath transcended millennia. Some even whispered of the Emperor's will, asserting that the Wraith was a living testament to his vigilance, sent to remind humanity that bureaucracy and codex were no substitute for conscience and morality. Yet each theory carried risk, for speaking too openly of forces unbound by imperial law could lead to scrutiny, suspicion, or worse. Still, the truth resonated in every embered corridor. The Wraith enforced a standard older than governance, older than law, older than the Emperor's codex. Our alliance pressed further into the upper levels, tracing the passage of fire and shadow, witnessing entire districts reshaped by flame. We saw the Arbits forced to abandon procedural precision, Skitarii patrols recalibrate their sensors in real time, and manufactorums grind to halt under the psychic weight of an arbiter whose judgment could not be questioned. Even the most disciplined officers began to adopt instinct and intuition in place of procedure, noting the rhythm of the flame, the patterns of selection, and the echoes of morality made manifest. Every burned doorway, every scarred floor, was a lesson, a fragment of doctrine written in fire that no codex could fully translate. I began to understand that the Wraith's doctrine was not a set of rules, but a philosophy, a living testament that judgment is inseparable from knowledge, perception, and action. Its methods were terrifyingly precise. Innocent spared, the guilty exposed, the corrupt held accountable in ways that bureaucracy had failed to enforce for centuries. The city itself became a classroom, each charred corridor a lesson, each embered floor a lecture in morality beyond law. And in that realization I sensed a duality. The Wraith was both terror and teacher, executioner and philosopher, fire incarnate and conscience made flesh. By the end of that cycle, the upper districts were largely evacuated, their machinery idled, their citizens scattered into lower corridors or distant hives. The Imperium's forces had learned that conventional tactics were meaningless. Observation, understanding, and alignment with the Wraith's moral logic were the only ways to endure. Magos Valrun recorded these insights with fervor. Drakal prayed not for salvation but for clarity, and the laborer continued to trace the ash, an interpreter whose significance we only partially comprehended. The Wraith of Flame had transformed the hive not only physically, but philosophically, forcing all who survived to confront the limits of doctrine, law, and human comprehension. As we paused atop a collapsed walkway, smoke curling in serpentine tendrils around skeletal spires, I realized that our survival depended not on weapons, not on command, but on comprehension. To endure was to understand. To understand was to align, imperfectly yet necessarily, with a force that judged not by codex but by consequence, not by procedure, but by morality itself. And in that understanding the inferno of doctrine burned, a living testament that judgment, like fire, cannot be contained, only observed, understood, and endured. By the time we reached the uppermost levels of Gathis Hive, I began to sense the weight of something far greater than the corridors, manufactorums, or scorched streets beneath our feet. The Wraith of Flame was no longer a force confined to a single hive or district. Its passage seemed to reverberate across the layers of existence itself, an echo that pulsed through the corridors of the Imperium like a heartbeat we could neither measure nor resist. Even the air seemed charged with a resonance that could not be detected by sensors, a vibration that suggested the flame's judgment was reaching beyond mere flesh and steel, touching principles older than Terra, older than the Emperor's reign, older even than the stars themselves. Magos Valren recorded every anomaly with meticulous care, her cybernetic optics capturing subtleties invisible to the unaugmented eye. Heat distortions that lingered too long, faint electromagnetic shifts in the air, and minute vibrations along structural supports that suggested the hive itself trembled at the Wraith's passage. Drekal, standing beside her, muttered prayers that wove through both imperial liturgy and personal supplication, an attempt to anchor himself in belief as the scale of what we faced expanded beyond comprehension. The laborer, as ever, moved silently among the ash and scorched metal, tracing patterns that suggested a logic, a sequence, a language written in fire that none of us could speak but all of us felt. Reports from the upper districts of Gathis Hive confirmed our observations. Fires flared in manufactorums where no promethium lines flowed. Machinery failed without mechanical explanation, and Arbit's squads vanished into corridors that appeared unchanged when reconnoitered later. Even the Mechanicus admitted, behind locked doors and sacred cogitators, that no known technology could account for the anomalies. They whispered of ancient fragments of enforcers, of relics long buried and oath-bound, yet all their calculations were tentative. Every sensor, every formula, every sanctioned protocol bent and broke beneath the Wraith's presence. It moved with intent, yet its intentions were inscrutable, its logic not merely beyond comprehension but entwined with a morality we could feel, but not define. As we traced its path, I began to notice echoes of its judgment beyond the immediate hive. Minor shrines reported flickers of fire in distant sectors. Cults whispered of visions of skeletal wheels blazing across the sky, and even sanctioned psychers caught fleeting impressions in the warp, sensations of a force measuring guilt and virtue in ways that transcended human law. No one could say for certain whether these echoes were real or figments shaped by fear and superstition. Yet the consistency of reports suggested a phenomenon of true scale. The Wraith was no longer a localized predator. It had become a resonance, a presence that extended across time, perception, and perhaps even dimension. Within the hive, the Embered Alliance continued to follow, attempting to understand a force that defied law and reason. Each encounter became more abstract, more difficult to quantify. Doors melted without heat, floors buckled where no weight had passed, and whispers of flame lingered in corridors long after the engine's roar had vanished. Magos Valren recalibrated sensors to record these subtle phenomena, attempting to translate perception into data. Yet every measurement seemed incomplete, every calculation inadequate. Drekal's prayers grew louder, not in fear alone, but in awe of the inexorable logic that burned behind the fire. Even the laborer moved with a kind of reverent certainty, reading the ash and soot as if it were scripture, a guide to understanding the moral calculus enacted by the Wraith. I realized then that the Wraith's fire was a language of consequence, a pattern of judgment that resonated not only through the hive but through every level of perception, from the tangible to the spiritual, from the mundane to the arcane. Each passage left a memory, each embered corridor a record of morality encoded in flame, a testament that human law, no matter how codified or enforced, was insufficient to contain what had arrived. Its judgment was absolute, impartial, and eternal, and in its wake every observer, every survivor, every Arbites officer and Skitari augur was forced to reckon with their own comprehension of justice, morality, and duty. As we paused atop a collapsed spire, smoke curling around skeletal towers and the distant glow of molten manufactorums illuminating the twilight, I understood that the Wraith of Flame was not merely a predator, nor merely a judge. It was a resonance of eternity, a force that measured the weight of human action against a standard older than the Imperium, older than the Emperor, and perhaps older than humanity itself. The echoes of its passage reverberated not only through stone and metal, but through perception, conscience, and the very structure of what we called reality. And in that understanding, awe replaced fear. Not relief, not triumph, but recognition that survival alone was meaningless. Comprehension was the only currency here, and the Wraith of Flame demanded payment in the measure of understanding, insight, and moral alignment. As the embered pathways stretched before us into the haze of the upper districts, I felt for the first time the true scale of what we faced. A force whose judgment could not be bargained with, whose logic could not be contested, and whose resonance would echo through eternity, long after the ashes of Gathis Hive had settled. The upper districts of Gathis Hive had become a crucible, the air thick with heat, ash, and a tension that pressed against the lungs like iron bands. Smoke curled in serpentine ribbons through shattered corridors, reflecting the ghostly glow of molten metal, and every step forward felt like walking through the very conscience of the Imperium itself. The Wraith of Flame moved ahead of us, its skeletal wheels blazing brighter than any Prometheum flare, yet it did not burn indiscriminately. Its passage had become a measure of morality, its judgment written in fire and ash, and I realized with a quiet dread that the crucible we entered was not merely physical but spiritual, an unavoidable trial of conscience and understanding. Magos Valryn led the way with her sensors active, scanning heat signatures, structural shifts, and the faint distortions of the air itself. Her calculations had grown increasingly complex, a fusion of machine logic and ritualized observation. Yet she admitted quietly that no cogitator could model the patterns completely. Even Drekel, whose faith in law and codex had always been absolute, felt the shift in authority. His Arbit's training, once the cornerstone of his confidence, now seemed inadequate against a force that neither obeyed nor feared human law. And the laborer, silent and unassuming as ever, traced the scorched paths with fingers blackened by ash, whispering prayers older than any sanctioned liturgy. We moved as one, fragile and uncertain, through corridors that seemed alive, as though the hive itself recognized the passage of the Wraith and adjusted in acknowledgement or warning. When the Wraith appeared, it was as if the air itself ignited. A skeletal engine, wheels wreathed in flame yet impossibly controlled, moving with intent and deliberation. Its roar was not merely sound but a presence, a weight that pressed into the minds of all who watched. Arbit squads that attempted to intercept found themselves outmaneuvered before they even fired. Doors melted in their hands, corridors shifting in impossible ways. Skitarii patrols recalibrated sensors, but the readings made no sense. The Wraith was simultaneously present and elsewhere, moving not just through space but through intention. Its judgment was immediate, impartial and incomprehensible, yet unmistakably deliberate. We realized then that the Crucible was not an arena for combat alone. The Wraith measured understanding, perception, and moral alignment. Magos Valryn's calculations, Drekal's prayers, the laborer's whispered guidance, these were as vital as weapons. We could not force the flame, nor could we resist it. We could only observe, anticipate, and align ourselves with its logic, imperfectly but necessarily. Each passage through the embered corridors became a test, a trial in which hesitation, error, or moral blindness was punished by absence, disappearance, or worse. The fire was an arbiter, the ash a record, and the smoke a reminder that even the Imperium's machinery was subordinate to this judgment. Through a shattered manufactorum, the Wraith moved with precision, isolating areas of corruption, negligence, and cruelty. Entire rooms melted into molten rivers of promethium and ash, yet others remained untouched. It chose carefully, its patterning deliberate, as if weighing the intent of those within. Arbits and Skitarii alike began to adapt instinctively, adjusting movement and observation to the rhythm of the Wraith's judgment. Even the laborer, whose unassuming presence had always been peripheral, now guided us through corridors with an uncanny sense of timing, interpreting the flame as if reading scripture written in heat and shadow. As the crucible intensified, the upper districts were effectively immobilized. Machinery idled, manufactorums ceased production, and citizens fled to lower sectors or abandoned hive blocks entirely. The Imperium's forces, for all their codices and discipline, were powerless to intervene directly. Observation, understanding, and alignment had become the only tools of survival. Magos Valryn recorded every distortion, every embered pattern, every intangible nuance of the Wraith's movement. Drekal's prayers shifted, blending Arbite's liturgy with personal supplication, a dialogue with forces beyond law, and the laborer moved as an interpreter, guiding the alliance through corridors of judgment that tested comprehension as much as courage. By the end of this day-long trial, I realized the Crucible had done more than test us, it had transformed us. The Embered Alliance had survived not by firepower, not by strategy alone, but through understanding, observation, and the fragile alignment of perception and morality. The Wraith of Flame had reshaped the Hive, recalibrated our instincts, and forced the Imperium itself to confront its limitations. The Crucible of Judgment had burned away the superficial layers of authority, leaving only truth, consequence, and the stark reflection of human failure. And as the skeletal engine disappeared into corridors yet untouched, I understood that survival was no longer merely a question of strength or firepower, but of comprehension, alignment, and moral acuity. When the fires finally ebbed, Gathis' hive was unrecognizable. Corridors once humming with the endless grind of manufactorums lay blackened and silent. Stairwells collapsed under their own weight, and smoke lingered in the air like the breath of a titan who had passed unseen. The Wraith of Flame had vanished as silently as it had arrived, leaving behind not devastation in the conventional sense, but a ledger written in ash and ember. Every scorched surface, every molten pool of promethium, every shadowed alcove bore witness to the judgments passed, to the sins revealed, and to the truths that no Arbite's tribunal or Mechanicus cogitator could have catalogued. The hive itself seemed to breathe, settling into the silence, the hum of survival mixed with the echo of flame. Magos Valren moved among the remnants with cautious reverence. Her sensors, no longer fully able to detect the residual anomalies, flickered in uncertainty as she recorded what she could. The flames had left traces too subtle for even augmented optics, distortions in metal, faint residual heat patterns, and echoes in the structural lattice that suggested the Wraith's presence had been more than physical. She muttered fragments of calculation and prayer, a hybrid of tech liturgy and mechanical obsession, knowing full well that her records could never fully capture what had occurred. Drekal, whose Arbite's discipline had been tested beyond measure, wandered through the corridors, whispering prayers not of supplication, but of acknowledgement. The law of man had proven insufficient, yet the Wraith's judgments had been absolute, impartial, and inescapable. The laborer, silent as ever, moved among the remnants with a strange grace. He traced scorched patterns, whispered fragments of forgotten hymns, and left offerings of scrap metal in burned corridors. He had survived the Crucible without understanding fully why, yet his presence suggested that comprehension, not mere strength or obedience, had been the key to endurance. The Embered Alliance had endured, but we were changed. Observation, alignment, and understanding had replaced conventional measures of survival. We had become students in a school without teachers, witnesses to a force that was both executioner and philosopher. In the days following, reports trickled into the higher echelons of the Imperium. Mechanicus archives were updated cautiously, Arbite's records filed with vague notes of anomaly, and minor governors whispered of a fire that had swept through Gathis' hive with judgment beyond codex. The Wraith of Flame became legend almost immediately, a tale passed in whispers, prayers, and ritualized caution. Some described it as a fragment of the Emperor's will, others as a relic of ancient enforcers whose judgment endured beyond death. Scholars, psychers, and priests debated its nature in secrecy, yet no consensus emerged. Its existence, impact, and logic remained ineffable, a force that transcended calculation, law, and even perception. For those who had survived, the consequences were both personal and collective. Magos Valren devoted herself to studying the residual patterns, driven by the understanding that the Wraith's logic was a language of morality and consequence encoded in flame. Drekal reconciled his faith with the undeniable reality that human law was limited, that morality could be measured beyond codex, and that survival required more than obedience. And I, wandering through the silent corridors, recognized that the hive itself had been irrevocably transformed, a living record of judgment, memory, and consequence. Yet even as the ash settled, the Wraith's influence persisted. The echoes of its passage resonated in the minds of survivors, in the rhythm of smoke curling from still warm manufactorums, and in the faint residual heat in floors and walls. It had left not merely destruction but awareness, a lesson, a warning. a philosophy encoded in fire that demanded reflection, comprehension, and humility. Gathis Hive, scarred and silent, would never forget. Its citizens, whether laborer Arbites or Mechanicus Adept, carried the memory of judgment as a weight upon their conscience, and somewhere, beyond sight and sensor, the Wraith moved on, a skeletal engine of fire and morality, passing through corridors, manufactorums, and hives unknown, leaving in its wake not chaos alone but insight, consequence, and the inexorable reflection of humanity's failings. I understood then that the story did not end with its departure. It had only begun. The echoes of eternity would remain in every scorched corridor, every whispered legend, and every conscience brave enough to endure its flame. Survival was not enough. Comprehension was required. Alignment with its judgment, however imperfect, was mandatory. And in the ashes of Gathis Hive, I understood what few could. The wraith of flame was not merely fire, but eternity rendered in skeletal wheels and judgment. The hive had been tested. Humanity had been observed, and morality had been measured in ways no codex could dictate. And as I stepped carefully through the final scorched corridor, I whispered a prayer not for mercy but for understanding, knowing that the flame of judgment would return, somewhere, sometime, and that when it did, only those who had learned its lesson would endure.